Good evening and welcome to Rock Solid News Evening Edition. My name is Newfoundland and today it is November the 16th. It is a Tuesday. No, it is a Thursday today. And we got a great one for you tonight. It is called It's Like They Want Separatist Movements in Canada. Let's get into it.
So, the high school drama teacher over here accuses others of liking the sounds of their own voices.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I was a high school teacher before getting into politics, and I'm having a little trouble remembering what exactly the job that the Leader of the Opposition had before getting into politics.
Yes, and he left right in the middle of the semester, and I'm having trouble remembering why.
The small fringe minority who are holding unacceptable views do not represent the views of Canadians whose beds are filled with people who chose not to get vaccinated. The risk posed to all of us by unvaccinated people. It's never too late to do the right thing. We'll be immensely pleased to be able to give you that first dose of vaccine.
I'd like to welcome the fake news media,
and the ideology in order to push particular agendas. And I think some of those agendas, unfortunately, pretty hardcore, pretty extreme. The power of misinformation, because so much, of what we hear coming from these protesters from, a scientific perspective just isn't true. And
can you state categorically? You are fake news.
Sir.
Sir, you are fake news. Welcome back to Rock Solid News. It's Thursday. It's November the 16th, and we got a great one for you this evening. Tonight's episode is called It's Like They Want Separatist Movements in Canada. Jail time for them all. We've already got some comments rolling in. Love to hear it. And I agree. Can't say that I disagree. And most of them are fake news anyways. Yeah. So let's get into it. Tonight's episode, it's like they want the separatist movement in Canada, but I don't want you to get too excited because they've already made separation from Canada illegal through acts of legislation. And I think Nikki Hurley knows what I'm talking about in the comments section. Some of you may not. Some of you might be in Alberta right now. Some of you might be in Quebec right now, maybe even in BC. And thinking, you know what, separation seems like a good thing. Maybe it's coming to that in your province. I'm from Newfoundland. We have a history of a separatist movement here. We were basically forced and coerced into Canada to begin with. So don't get too excited about separation. Unless you've got a different way than Quebec tried, because when Quebec tried to do it democratically, we'll say, through referendum, the vote went however it went, 51 to 49. But after that came a piece of legislation called the Clarity Act, which was meant to clarify how a province could secede from Canada. And that'll be your as much of a spoiler as I'll give for now. We'll get into that and show you. But first, tonight's topic at hand. The way the government acts, I'm speaking to Canadians right now. This is a very Canadian-centric episode. Federally, provincially, and thusly through your provincial government, municipally, the way the governments are treating local, already citizens of the area is despicable. It's counterintuitive to how you would treat normal people, let alone people you're legally responsible for governing. Any non-psychopathic person would not, anyone who's non-psychopathic would not rule in the same way that our current leaders do. And when I say current, I don't mean liberal. Look, I'm wearing my liberal shill red, and I'm wearing my conservatively cucked blue to show you that I stand in complete unity with the nonsense that is political politics. Okay? And yes, slave talk, absolutely. And the reason it's slave talk, I wore my slave's noose here for you tonight. So think about it. Look at education, look at healthcare, look at homelessness, look at how your citizens are being treated locally. Quebec gets bribed to stay, says, I'm not going to try that. We'll just say Rumble says that in the chat because you guys can't see that over here. Now think about specific citizens in Canada and how they've been treated. Many of you know the name James Topp. We'll flick that up here for you very quickly. We covered that last night. Many of you know James Topp. He did a cross-Canada march raising awareness for his situation. I don't know what else to describe it. That's one aspect of how your media and your government are treating him, because he's being charged by the state. You might be familiar with during the convoy days, and we had the Coots boys that are, I believe, still in jail. You might know the name Jeremy Mackenzie. It's Welsh, says Rumble. Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, I'm Celtic, so I should be able to say it, but we'll leave it at that for now. The Coots boys, you've got Jeremy Mackenzie in Ontario, charged by the state. You've got Dana Metcalf here in Newfoundland, charged by the state. Okay. Now look around you. Provincially speaking, healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction. So how's your healthcare? Have you ever had to use the emergency room? Have you ever had to try to book a doctor's appointment and you don't have a family doctor? 70% of Newfoundlanders do not have a family doctor. Just let that number sink in. 70%. They don't have a family doctor. The majority of people are using walk-in clinics in Newfoundland. I suspect that's very similar in your province. And Nikki here is going to clarify for us. 5 are facing charges for Coots. Quebec seems to have special rights. Well, yeah. It's almost like they didn't sign on to the Constitution and the Charter of Rights, and it's almost like they operate as if they're a nation within a nation. I say almost as if sarcastically, obviously. You've got cronyism in government, right? And this, again, is liberal, it's conservative, it's whatever. Everyone, right? Here in Newfoundland, we had the elections officer, the man appointed by the government to preside over elections. We had him commit election fraud and then admit to committing election fraud on live radio before the election was even finished. Does anyone want to guess what happened? I'll give you 17 guesses, and the first 16 don't count. Nothing happened. The election went through with the election fraud having been admitted to, and we got our Liberal government. And Nikki, yes, you guessed it. What about your province autonomy? That's a good one. I wonder, it's almost like that's in the Constitution somewhere. Think about our Prime Minister here in Canada. How many ethics violations has the current sitting Prime Minister had? And cronyism happens from all parties, guys. This is not a Liberal thing. If you're old enough to remember Stephen Harper, don't think this is pointed specifically at Liberals. Your economy is being destroyed. Your local municipal economies are being destroyed. Your local supply chains are being destroyed in and changing them up for this new global supply chain that gets to break down whenever. I wonder why they would do that. Now, I want to give you a real life example. There's some people here. There's some Rumble people too. Manawadian, that'll be my one time trying that, and a couple more over there. And I've got some people here in Facebook land. Let's give you a real life example from this month, from yesterday and today, of how the government thinks about its actual people versus how it thinks and cares about immigrants and other people that they're bringing in. So We're going to come here, and I want you to pay attention to this date right here, November 15th. The story is that a Ukrainian family is leaving Newfoundland to return to the homeland, cites affordability. Okay? This is November 15th of 2023. This is yesterday. Marina, a mother of three, left the conflict in Ukraine earlier this year for the safety of Newfoundland and Labrador as the war rages on in that country. But now she's considering moving back due to problems finding affordable place to stay. Let me ask you, does finding an affordable place to stay compare to a country that's raging in war? Firstly, after months in a hotel, I can only suspect paid for by the government, not by her. She found a reasonably priced basement apartment, but now she won't be able to stay there long term, and instead of doing what's necessary to provide for her family, she's going to bring them back to a war-ravaged country. Not ravaged, it's being ravaged in real time, at least according to the VOCM. Okay, remember, what's our date? November 15th, 2023, which was yesterday. Okay, so what do you think happens when we look at the news from today, November 16th? Let's get into it. November 16th, from the same news source, VOCM, which is Voice of the Common Man, unironically, I believe. The very next day, there's an article saying the government offer has been declined by the Ukrainian mother who's leaving now. So yesterday, there was a story about how she's so desperate to find housing that she's going to move back to a war-ravaged country. This is in real time, guys. November 15th was yesterday. She can't find, well, we'll get to Tent City, Nikki. That's ironic. So the government offer was declined by her the very next day. The minister responsible for immigration said the government reached out to do something about this, and she declined the offer and is going back. Just consider that as an occurrence. First of all, are there any homeless people in St. John's? Is there anything that the government's been doing about it? Now, ask yourself this. Is there currently a mini tent city happening outside the provincial government building of homeless native Newfoundlanders and Labradorians who are tenting in a city, a mini city they've created, because they don't have anywhere to stay and the shelters have been filled? This tent city is on the provincial government building. This is from CBC. As of October 10th, they were in their second week. So, to fully appreciate what's occurring here, Ukrainians that we brought over here because we are encouraging the war that's ongoing in their country. So now we've allowed them to claim refugee status. We've brought them over here, and all this is money, from the war to the creation of refugees, to the transportation and relocation of refugees, to the housing of refugees and the feeding of refugees. All of this is coming on the Canadian dollar. Meanwhile, while that's occurring, and while these immigrants are now saying we can't even find proper housing here, we're going to go back to our war-torn country. All the while, Newfoundlanders are on the provincial government property with a tent city trying to find housing. This is how the government thinks about its people. This is the government showing its hand. And of course, there are still people that will make excuses. Like it's like Munchausen syndrome. This is like you're at this point you're protecting and lying for your abuser by making excuses for these people. Now, let's make sure that this fully sinks in, though, because I hear a lot of people talking separation, and they'll go back to Quebec was so close, just back in, when was it? 96, 7, something like that. Now, there was 2 referendums in Quebec, one in the 80s, and then again in the 90s. 51% said no, 49% said yes. Very well. So what happened after that? Well, the government realized that they were I mean, federal government now, realized they were dangerously close to having to deal with an actual separation of the Canadian quote-unquote union. Well, can't have that. So the people of Quebec had actually argued, what percentage would we actually require in order to trigger this? Is a simple majority, 51%, enough to trigger the results of the referendum? Some people argued you would require a supermajority, a 2/3, a 66%. Some argued even higher, a 3/4% would be required for something as drastic as separation. So, in its infinite wisdom, Daddy Government stepped in and created the Clarity Act, which was meant to clarify how a province can go about seceding legally through Parliament. This is, as you can see from the screen, let me make sure you can see it. Justice Law's website, Government of Canada banner on the top. And this is laws-justice.gc.ca/English/X/C-31.8/fulltext.html for anybody that's interested. I hope you are. This act is the Clarity Act, which is an act to give effect to the requirement for clarity as set out in the opinion of the Supreme Court of Canada in Quebec, in the Quebec secession referendum. So this is from the year 2000. And as you can see here, this is an act to give effect to the requirements for clarity as set out in the opinion of the Supreme Court of Canada. So, how can a province go about seceding? Quebec tried it and they were very close. Now the province needs, or the federal government needs legislation to deal with this. There's some very interesting wording in this, and I hope that this sinks in for people. This is the preamble where they make a bunch of statements that they kind of back up throughout the piece of legislation. The very first one in the preamble is kind of chilling, and then it gets worse from there. So, whereas the Supreme Court of Canada has confirmed that there is no right under international law or under the Constitution of Canada for the national legislature or government of Quebec to effect the secession of Quebec from Canada unilaterally. Unilaterally is an important word. So what they're saying is, regardless of the outcome of a referendum and regardless of what Quebec wants to put into effect due to the outcome of such referendum, they would still require permission and acceptance from Canada. It can't be unilaterally done. It can't be done solely through Quebec. Okay, very well. Let's keep going. This one is towards the bottom. It's the second, well, it's the last whereas on this piece of legislation. And this is by far, in my mind, the absolute most telling part of this legislation. Remember, this is clarifying how a province can legally separate from Canada if the population decides they want to and they vote for it. Okay, democracy as we're told. And whereas it is incumbent on the government of Canada not to enter into negotiations that might lead to the secession of a province from Canada, and that could consequently entail the termination of citizenship and other rights that Canadian citizens residents in the province enjoy as full participants in Canada, unless the population of that province has clearly expressed the democratic will that the province secede from Canada. The unless is useless there. It's not needed. But the very first part of this sentence, it is incumbent upon Canada not to enter into negotiations that might lead to the secession of a province from Canada. Obviously, if you leave Canada, you cease to enjoy the rights and privileges a citizen would have from that country. So I'm not really sure why they felt the need to kind of gaslight people with that one. And then you can go through, and this is a very small piece of legislation. If I scroll all the way to the bottom, you've got 3 main parts, or 5 main parts, and that's it. And the clear expression of, because that's what's your threshold. Does a simple majority of 51% do it? Do you need a super majority? Do you need some new type of majority that we're now going to have to go ahead and define? That's what you're going to want to look at. There's your expression of will. And then there's other views to be considered. There's no negotiation if the question is not clear. So the government of Canada gets to decide, was your question clear enough? And if we decide no, then it doesn't matter what happens in your vote. We're not going to enter into negotiations. And then the House of Commons gets to decide whether or not there's a clear case to secede. These are all things that prevent your democratic will from occurring. If a province decides that it wants to bow out from Canada, and it wants to do so in a democratic and legal way, it is forbidden from doing so. And the province, or the government of Canada, has decided to write legislation in for itself that makes it basically illegal or impossible for you to do so. So regardless of how a vote would go. Now, we do have one more thing to cover for tonight. And this is just to drive home again how much the people who rule over you do not care for you. This is a statement from the RCMP. We'll zoom right in here first so you can see. RCMP -grc.gc.ca. Carbonear collegiate teacher charged with sexual offenses against former student. This was put out, as you can see, November 15th, 2023, which was yesterday, from the Harbour Grace Detachment, which is the next town over from Carbonear, which is the town here in question, Carbonear Collegiate. Criminal charges have been laid against Carbonear Collegiate teacher, 54-year-old Paul Thomas of Coley's Point, in relation to allegations of sexual assault against a former student that occurred in 2015. They received the initial report in August and conducted a thorough investigation, which included the execution of a search warrant at Thomas's home on October 2023, and a number of electronic devices were seized and examined. So he was arrested at his residence on the 6th, and he was then released. He's no longer teaching, at least while the investigation goes on. Just one more in a long line of public education teachers absolutely just corrupting the youth. You can go back as far as you want and find this all over public education. And no, I'm not advocating for the Catholic Church to take the education system back. I know what happened there too. But two wrongs don't make it right, especially when it comes to abusing children. So you want to wonder why there's a movement of homeschooling going on in your province, your country, your community. This is why. I went to a school called Holy Heart of Mary High School in St. John's. We had a teacher there with so many allegations of what they called misconduct at the time, which is like 16 years ago now. But he was close to retirement. So what do? You can't punish the man for abusing children. Then he wouldn't get his pension. So they made a rule that he had to keep his door open. His classroom door always had to stay open. It was like kind of wedged consistently open. That way, the young girls in his classroom would feel safe knowing they wouldn't get abused or mistreated because his door was open. That way, he was allowed to stay on as an honorable man and not have any allegations brought forward against him and keep his pension. If you know anyone who went to other schools in St. John's, you'll get the same thing. And this was the public education system. This is the government-run public education system. This is after the Catholic education system had its go. And yes, Elizabeth, absolutely. Unions protect their teachers from accountability. Policy is for corporations, right? Which is a good way to transition into Nikki's comment of just go back to Hudson Bay Charter, which is essentially what is governing you to this day. Think about your own province's pension plan or the federal pension, regardless. So tonight's episode, it's like they want a separatist movement in Canada. You know why? They can push you to the brink of separation. And you can't do anything about it because they've already protected themselves. Just like they've already protected themselves from liability against vaccine damage, against vaccine mandates and mask mandates. No healthcare worker and frontline worker can be held liable. No government agency and government member can be held liable for this. They've written accountability out for themselves. And then they push you to the point where you say, I want to leave. And you get mad enough that you say, we're done and we have a referendum. And then you present your results to the federal government as a province. And they say no, because they're allowed to. This is Canada. This is what Canada is, what it always has been. And I don't know what to tell you. I don't have an answer for you. The only way I can see it is if enough people stood up together and said, no, enough is enough. I won't partake anymore. What does that do? More than what's happening right now. That's all I can tell you. The first step is to get mad. After that, you got to focus your anger and figure out what's happening and what you can tangibly do. Probably build a community around you. You're going to need it. So that seems like a great way to end tonight's episode. It is Thursday, November 16th still. And thank you for tuning in to Rock Solid News. You people, you stay sovereign, okay?